I mean, Tim Ferriss famously says he doesn't know any billionaires that don't do psychedelics. And then we've seen microdosing kind of. So in Silicon Valley back in the 60s, they took engineers who had a problem that they couldn't solve for a few months, gave them a psychedelic. And I don't know, 2/3 of them were able to solve the problem that they were going after. It was a big number. It's a pretty famous study. And since then, so why I think Silicon Valley is like, well, if that works for macro doses, what if we just take a little bit of drugs and maybe that helps us be more creative? And again, the research is split, but that's kind of led to that in the business world. What I like about it for business people is that, okay, you can take these psychedelics and get back to the root of why and to remembering that you don't have to do any of these things to be who you are and to be worthy of love and to be worthy of just worthy, period. And you can choose to do whatever things you want to do and live with that alignment. And that is, I think that's just pretty incredible as a business tool.
And we're live for another episode of Being Human with Matt Zemon. He's an expert in psychedelic wellness. He's also the author of this book, The Veteran's Guide to Psychedelics, a preparation and integration workbook. I'm really excited, Matt, to have you on the show and learn more about this important healing modality.
I appreciate you having me on and bringing this topic up for your audience. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you. Let's start with a bit about yourself, your background. I love to hear people's backstories, where you grew up, the early Matt experience, and then leading into your interests now.
I grew up in Philadelphia, so northeastern here, United States, and was a business person for just a lot of years. And in my 40s, some friends invited me to a guided magic mushroom journey. I didn't know what that was or why I'd want to do it. It wasn't what I did. And but something inside of me said yes. And I went ahead and had this experience. And it completely changed the way I look and interact with the world. And that led me to going back to school to get a master's in psychology and neuroscience focused on psychedelic medicine. It's led me to travel the world working with taitas and shamans and maestros and experiencing different types of psychedelics for a variety of purposes. And now I get to write books and work with medical providers and how to incorporate spiritual best practices. And I work with spiritual leaders and how to incorporate medical best practices. And I'm just having a lot of fun with the learning and sharing of information as it relates to psychedelics.
Wow. Okay. So what business were you in?
So I've been a serial entrepreneur. I've had a number of different businesses and had some good, lucky fortune to have sold some of these businesses, but all very geeky, technical businesses. So far, not related to this. When I went back for that master's in science from King's College, by the way, not terribly far from where you are.
Right. Yes.
I hadn't taken a science class in like 25 years or something. It was super, super hard to get back into the swing of things. But yeah, so completely different trajectory post psychedelic than pre psychedelic.
Wow. I can understand why you dedicated your life to it. But I'm interested in the context of the switch then. So at the point where you decided to go on this trip, had you at that point sold your businesses and you're sitting on some cash, or were you kind of active in the flow of being a CEO?
Yeah, I'm still active and still actually own one of my businesses that I was owning at that time. The difference for me was I left that experience really knowing that I didn't need to be as involved in that business as I had been, and that I had great people around me and we had systems in place, and I could go focus on some other things and allow that business to thrive on its own. And that's really worked out for me and my family.
Right. And so, because often I hear with people who go and take these experiences, they're dealing with some kind of life crisis, but for you, it was just more curiosity. This sounds fun. This sounds interesting.
Really, I actually said no the first time it was offered to me. I was like, I don't do drugs. I like things the way I like things. I don't even didn't even drink all that much because I just like, yeah, it just wasn't what I did. But my friend said, but wait a minute, you're a lifelong learner. And this is like the greatest opportunity to learn more about yourself. And you love to travel. And this is like going on this wild trip, this expedition in your mind. Why would you not say yes to this when we've hired this person who's an expert in what they do and you are going to be safe and in this great space with people you love? And they were pretty compelling. So I went in with pretty low expectations. Um, but truly, it blew all my expectations out the water. I mean, the biggest thing that I write about in my first book, in Psychedelics for Everyone, was that I reconnected with my mom, who died when I was 22 and she was 49. And in this journey, she was there, and I could pull like a string from her to me to my kids, and I could see how we were all connected, and that I was carrying her forward, and that they were carrying me forward, and it was so incredibly healing. And I realized in that first experience how safe and loved I felt. And then I realized, wait a minute, I don't feel this level of safety and love in my everyday life. What's going on with that? And just those two alone, and there were other things that happened in that first journey, made it for me just such an incredibly transformative experience.
Wow. And were you engaged in any other kind of self work at the time? Therapy or spiritual practice?
Not really. No, I'd kind of given up on God when my mom, at that point, when my mom died back then. Yeah, and I wasn't in therapy. I was in an entrepreneurs group. We a group of CEOs met monthly and talked about business, personal, and family. And I think that is really was a good self work starting point for me. But
Mm.
this has led down. I mean, I'm going for a doctorate in ministry right now. It's so completely different than where I was
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
not that many years ago.
And I have to say, as you speak, and your energy is very calming. You certainly have this sense of a spiritual quality to your being. I'm certainly feeling that. So you go in there, you're in the CEO group, and then you go on this weekend. Talk me, because I think there's going to be a lot of people who haven't done this, who are intrigued by the process. So kind of slow it down and talk me through
Well,
the
and
steps of
yeah, and
of this
let me
first
actually
ceremony.
back it up for your audience, just because I mean I think what happened with me with taking this huge left turn is not what normally happens. So let's
Yeah.
not. I don't want to say that if you go and do psychedelics, you're going to quit your job or quit your business. That's not what happens. What I do want to say for many people, when they use these tools or this technology, if we're going to use the business terminology, when they use this technology to journey within,
Mm.
um, it helps me and helps others, um, kind of understand the why. What is the root of fill in the blank? So for me, it's okay if I can take this medicine and then remember that I am loved just as I am. I can remember that my essence that I'm a spiritual being having a human experience. I can remember that these different stories that I've told myself, or these different behaviors that I choose to do, might not be in alignment with this new remembrance. And then from that point, I can then say, well, what do I want to do? And how do I want to behave? And how do I want to show up to every conversation? And how do I want to move through this world? And for many people, that's okay. I now have a new way of interacting with this job that I have. I have a new way of interacting with my wife or my husband. I have a new way of interacting with my children. I have a new way of interacting with my friends. Um, because it helps put us in a different type of alignment. Does that make sense?
It does make total sense. But I've never been on one of these retreats, and
Mhm.
I'm just super curious about the process of it.
Sure. I can tell you
So
what.
yeah,
And
just to hear that story. Yeah.
Yeah, so let's just back this up, just divide this retreats into two categories, just again for your listeners. So how do people access psychedelics, whether they're in the UK or in America? Some will access it in a medical model, meaning they want to have a diagnosis and they want to have access to something that's legal. So in
Yeah.
America, that's ketamine. I think it's ketamine in the UK as well. And
Mm.
you get a prescription and it's used off label for depression and anxiety and OCD and eating disorders and so on. And that's kind of one path you can take. The other path is to fly in an airplane and go to a jurisdiction where there is a legal option for you, or it's to go kind of underground. And typically, underground is either spiritual. So in America, as an example, there are a few hundred, maybe 1,000 psychedelic churches, or it's kind of therapeutic. There are therapists and coaches who work in this underground model. I'll talk for a moment about what happens in the spiritual communities that I'm most familiar with. If
Mm.
you were to sign up, the first thing that really anyone should do is they do a medical intake on you and they look at your prescriptions and your supplements and your height and your weight and your family history and your physical history and just make sure that there are um, really no contraindications, nothing that's jumping up saying, if you're on an antidepressant and you're thinking about MDMA or ayahuasca, that's a danger. If you're on an antidepressant and you're thinking about psilocybin, not a danger. So they do a medical intake. They hopefully discuss the results with you. Hey, we didn't see anything that was a high risk, or this looks odd or off. Are you sure this is something you want to do? Or we're not comfortable working with you because of this. And yeah, so there's a range of things that can happen after a medical intake. We then do a preparation call where it's you get some exercises about how do you set your intentions, how do you prepare your body and your mind for what's about to happen. Ideally, they talk to you about this is the medicine you're going to be taking. This is how long it's going to be in your body. This is the things that might happen to you. These are the agreements about how the room is going to be while you're on under the influence of this medicine.
Mm.
So you go over all of that in advance. You answer any questions. You hopefully sign some type of informed consent. I know what I'm getting into. I know I'm either doing a medical treatment or I'm not doing a medical treatment, and I'm okay with that. Um, all those things happen in advance. And then we get to the day of. And ideally, I love it when there's some kind of breath work or yoga or meditation or all of it before the ceremony. I love it when the rules and the agreements are restated before the ceremony. Um, and then I love it. I personally prefer group or community ceremonies versus one-on-one ceremonies because I think it's such a good reminder of how interconnected we all are. And that energy moves around the room. Um, in our ceremonies, there's typically 3 to 6 kind of musician facilitators who are creating a custom soundscape based on how the energy is moving. Um, and then, and I'm going to quickly do this and I'll stop talking. We then move, let's pretend ceremony's over. We typically do a few integration phone calls with exercises after ceremony. And we do, and then the communities that some of the communities I work with have in-person drop-ins and non-medicine things, whether they're sanghas or songs of devotion or other work that happens or that any spiritual community would do. They do those as well. And I think there's a lot of healing that happens when you are around people who are all kind of exploring themselves, exploring consciousness, and have a community in which you can share, um, share what's happening on that journey.
Mm.
That was a long answer.
Yeah. No. Okay. Well, that really helped set the scene. So you outlined the, these categories. There's the spiritual, there's the underground, and there's the medical. And that first one you did with your friend who persuaded you, which
Mhm.
which camp was that in?
It would be more of the spiritual.
The spiritual. And so you flew on an airplane somewhere?
We did. No, sorry, we did not for that first one. It was here. To be spiritual and underground is what I would call it.
Underground, spiritual
Yeah.
underground. Uh, and
It's tricky here in the States, Richard, in that there are only so we have in theory, our country was founded on religious freedom and then we have this Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And there are only 4 churches, psychedelic churches, that have actually been given a true exemption from the United States government to actually practice legally in America. The rest of these churches operate in this very gray zone where they say, okay, we are protected by law and by statute, but we're not operating legally. And what does that mean? What it means is those churches have a hard time getting things like insurance. They have challenges with arbitration agreements. With like, what do you do if there's a slip and a fall in one of these instances? Let alone, what do you do if someone has a contraindication?
Right.
So it's really tricky to find that balance here. But I also think these same questions that we're talking about, what happens before, what happens during, what happens after, what is the mindset, what is the source of the medicine, what is the setting, um, those same questions apply in the medical realm. They apply in this underground realm, and they apply for anyone hopping on a plane and going to a retreat in Jamaica or Colombia or Peru. These same questions need to be asked because it is definitely a consumer. It's up to the consumer to know what they want, and then to make sure that's what they're getting. There are
Mm.
ayahuasca retreats that are quote popular that do 100 people at a time. There are other ayahuasca retreats that are 20 people, 40 people, 10 people. It's not that one is right and one is wrong. It's, do you know what you want? And then are you able to get it? There are
Yeah.
legal ketamine, where they offer you preparation in these beautiful journeys with blankets and masks and music, and then integration sessions. And then there's other ketamine providers where they're going to put an IV in your arm. They're going to give you your ketamine. They're going to give you time to recover, and they're going to send you on your way.
Right.
And that is an ideological difference of some who believe it's biochemical and others who believe it's biochemical, psychosocial, spiritual. Both are legal, but it's up to us as consumers to know what we want and then to get it.
Right. Right. And you went to this underground church, underground setting, and you're there with your friends, and yeah, just talk me through that initial process for you.
Yeah, I mean, so in that particular setting, we all brought items for our altar and we put them up on the altar. We all sat around and we had some meditation time. We had time to consume the sacrament, is what the language was used at that time. And then from the time in that case, with time we ate the sacrament to when the medicine really started to being felt was, I think, 30 minutes to an hour. And in that particular setting, that facilitator um, was more open to a time in the container, so time in that physical space, and then time outside. At this point in my thinking about how to keep people as safe as possible on these journeys, I would prefer, and I do prefer, for people to stay in a physical container throughout the process.
Right.
I just think it's safer. But
Yeah.
that's not what that particular guide believed. So it's just, again,
Yeah.
it's a philosophical difference.
Mm.
I mean, it was beautiful and it all worked out. But I also, having now watched hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people journey, it's I think having eyes on all participants at all times is an important part of keeping the risk as reduced as possible for every participant.
Right. That makes sense. And this, you take the, and which form was it of
That was
psychedelic?
psilocybin. So that was mushrooms. For those who don't know what psilocybin is the active ingredient in these quote magic mushrooms. And in that particular setting, we just chewed a plate of dried mushrooms. So each of us had, I think, 5 to 6 grams that day, which
Right.
is a substantial amount of
Yeah. Is that
mushrooms.
what they call a hero dose?
Yeah, that language is used with that. That is, I think, at 5 grams is kind of the threshold for that. I don't love that language. And I am not criticizing. I just don't love it because I think it puts in this I think it puts in a level of competition and a level
Right. Yeah.
of that's not really needed. That amount of um mushrooms is a perfect amount for some people, and some need significantly less, and some need significantly more. And a really good facilitator is going to help the individual figure out what the right amount is for them.
Wow.
And just because someone took 3 grams doesn't make them any more or less of a hero than someone who took 5 or took 9. It's just a different body types and different metabolism and different ways of and different levels of surrender.
Right. And you mentioned you connected with your mother. That was one of the things that happened once it kicked in.
It did. I mean, it was a little bit into the little ways into the journey, but yeah, connecting with her, feeling her presence was such a gift. And since then, I've not only had for myself. I mean, I had another experience where, this is going to sound strange, but I had an experience where I held my father's hand like 100 times, and I could just see. I was like, oh, I was holding his hand here, and I was holding his hand here, and holding his hand here, and I had a more complex relationship with my father. He was an alcoholic. We only saw him on weekends after our parents got divorced, and that was a reminder to me that while he struggled with his own demons, he never made us feel like he didn't want us around. And in his own way, that was his way of showing me how much he loved me, even though he's incapable of kind of the normal ways of expressing that love. And it was really quite a treat to be able to have an experience where I could hold his hand that many times. And I've seen so many people who've been able to connect with loved ones and friends through these tools, without promising it. That, again, for your listeners who are listening, you would never want to say, my expectation for the psychedelic journey is to connect with blank. And when it happens, it's beautiful.
Right. And I can see why, from that first experience connecting with your mother, you could see the benefit. Right? You had an appetite to do more, or to explore this further.
Oh my God. I mean, I just remember coming down and being like, what the hell was that experience? I need to learn more about this. And there's this whole other world that I didn't know existed. And since then, I've seen so many incredible things using these tools, and these tools are catalysts. These tools are you take the medicine every once in a while, but the after effects, the change in life is where the work is done. And I've loved having the ability to do both, to be able to have moments of time when I use these psychedelics to connect with source, to connect with the interconnectedness of all things, to remember who I am, to feel this amount of love. And I've loved the process of introducing meditation and contemplative practice into kind of my everyday living.
Interesting. Because I do hear, I've had that described by people before, that these tools can accelerate the spiritual journey. Would that be true for you, would you say?
It is for me. And I put there's like a caution flag in this. Of course, it can absolutely accelerate the spiritual journey. This is where the integration process, I think, is so important, that people have, whether it's a teacher or a spiritual community or a therapist or a coach or someone on the other side of the psychedelic who can help us take those insights and awarenesses, awakenings, and document them and remember them, and then turn them into real, meaningful, lasting change. So the tool is such a great catalyst for, oh my God, I didn't know blank, and now I see blank, and now I feel blank. Great. And then how do we make sure we don't forget? And that's the
Right.
integration process. And that, I mean, you talked about the Veterans Guide. That's what a lot of that book is about, is, okay, now how do you take it from I see and turn it into, and therefore I'm going to do this.
Right. And I know you mentioned in this book, the Veterans Guide, about these aren't, in most cases, addictive, these substances, for most people. Is that accurate?
Yeah. It's, and again, Richard, it's just so funny, because as we've all grown up, and I mean, you seem to be about my age. We grew up in the just say no generation. We were told that all these drugs are
Mm.
bad. They're going to lead to addiction. They're going to cause great harm. There's no medical use. And we were living in a prohibition and no one told us. So now we have 200 plus academic institutions studying psychedelics. We're getting more and more information. And one of the things that we are learning, and I'll stick with psilocybin, is psilocybin has been study after study has shown it to be both non-toxic and non-addictive. I love this study from sticking since you're from the UK with Imperial College Dr. David Nutt, where he said, let's just have a responsible adult discussion about drugs and let's look at drugs, forget how they're classified, and just look at harm to self and harm to others. And on the far left-hand side of his chart, the most dangerous drug for harm to self and harm to others is alcohol. It's a 72 in his chart. And you work your way down, drug after drug after drug after drug. On the far right-hand side, psilocybin mushrooms are a 6, LSD is a 7, MDMA is a 9. Now, I don't want your audience to come away from this saying these drugs are safe. I don't like that word. What we're talking about here is relative risk. A lot of harm can happen in that 6, just like a lot of harm can happen in that 72. All drugs have danger. Acetaminophen, the active ingredient in over-the-counter painkillers, kills over 400 people in America each year. So nothing is safe. It's relative risk. And then how do we as consumers, as participants, as congregations, if we're going to continue on the spiritual path, how do we mitigate the relative risk? And that's where source, how do we know that our drugs aren't tainted? Set the mindset that we go into the experience, and setting what's the physical environment going to be like. That's where those things play a big, big role.
Mm. Yeah. And it sounds like am I right, in your usage of the psilocybin, the mushrooms, you take some, you integrate, and when you feel ready for another experience, you go back. It's not but nothing like an addiction. It's more like going to church, I suppose. It's like you go, you experience, you get some insights, and then when you're ready, you go back again.
Yeah, I certainly think it's more like going to church. And that's how they were used. I mean, historically in indigenous cultures. Now, some of these communities would be a once in a lifetime experience, and then others it would be a more regular experience. It could be once a month, it could be once a quarter, it could be based on the solstice, all sorts of different things. But no, most of these drugs are actually anti-addictive. I'll stick with psilocybin. If you were to take mushrooms today and tomorrow and the next day, each day your body would adjust to those mushrooms and not allow you to get the same experience to the point where they have no effect.
Interesting.
In animal studies, when you know something's addictive is when you give an animal a choice of having food or having whatever it is, having cocaine. The animals love the cocaine. They won't go back for mushrooms. They will choose food. So
Fascinating.
That's one example.
And what I also found of interest was the anecdote about Bill Wilson, who started Alcoholics Anonymous and cited that his experiences with LSD had helped him in his spiritual journey. And I thought that's fascinating because I spent a long time in AA or in 12-step AA and other 12-steps groups. And yeah, the mantra is don't take anything. Some of us believed there was an easier, softer path, right? The idea is that, yeah, people who stray from just doing the meetings and abstaining from everything are taking a risk with their sobriety. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, Bill Wilson, the founder of AA, had strayed from that path of sobriety, experienced the use of drugs, and it benefited him in his recovery from addiction. So I thought that was fascinating. And I was in AA for years and I did not know that. And I'm sure many, many others in 12-step group do not know that.
There's some really interesting letters between Bill W. and Carl Jung about asking about psychedelics and what Jung thought in Bill W.'s opinion. I think at the root of AA and the other 12-step programs is this notion of giving yourself up and recognizing that there is a higher power. And I think that is the first step in these programs. And Bill W. said, and the language he used was funny language. He said, as drunks, we have a hard time taking that first step. And LSD might be a way to assist drunks in that first step. His organization did not agree with him, but that's where he was coming from, is how do we take that first step? But certainly in my experience, when people choose to use psilocybin or ayahuasca or sassafras in intentional, or iboga in an intentional ceremonial setting, you might come in as an atheist, but my experience is you come out understanding that there's something else, that we are connected, that we are, again, spiritual beings having a human experience, that there is some source of this. And it's pretty remarkable that that can happen so reliably. Can you get there with meditation, or can you get there with other practices? Of course you can. Um, but you also might not with these. More often than not, you can get there.
Yeah, that's interesting you say that, because my sense is I got there through therapy and meditation. I just, for whatever reason, the opportunity, the call wasn't there for me to experiment. It's not like I have had one experience, but it's never been a big part of my healing journey. So I think I was in the camp of those who kind of got there via a different route. But I'm fascinated because partly it's by the thought that I could have got here quicker. The sort of engineer in me is interested in, maybe there was a better way. But nonetheless, I'm fascinated by the thought of the impact this could have on society. If this was if this was a tool that was widely available, it was broadly safe, and it could help people get closer to their own spirit, that for me represents an enormous opportunity for society. Because not everybody's going to find their way there through yoga and meditation. I resisted yoga and meditation for 10 to 15 years. So that's why I'm fascinated by the topic.
I love that. I love that there's room for multiple paths up the mountain. And I think that's what I try to get across. I'm not saying that everyone should take a psychedelic, but I do think we need to have this information because we grew up in a prohibition. So whether the psychedelic is for an individual personally, or whether understanding how it might help someone they love, or whether understanding just helping them have the information when they go to the ballot box. We just had such bad information for so many years. And I think it's important. And like you said, some people say, I don't have any interest in this. I want to climb the mountain this way. Great. Go climb the mountain that way. But respecting for those who choose this particular path and do it in a manner that is, again, as responsible as possible. I think giving them the space to do that legally, to bring up and have open discussions about how medical and spiritual can work together is important. And it's important that this becomes legal so that we don't have people with medical licenses worried about losing their licenses by supporting psychedelic churches. And we don't have psychedelic churches who are operating in the dark so much so that they're not keeping their congregations as safe as possible, or that the members aren't able to find out good information about them because it's so hush hush. So we need this to become above ground. In the old days, we just had healer. The healer is both a medical healer and a spiritual healer. And we in our society, we've separated those roles. And I get it. I understand that we've given pure science to the doctors and we've given the death to the clergy. But with these medicines that occasion spiritual experiences, if we were to just give that to the clergy, well, they don't have the latest information about our brains and our bodies to keep us safe. And if we were to give it just to the science, they have no spiritual training. So what do we do? How do we collaborate? And to collaborate, we need to be legal and we need to have open discussions just like we're having right now, Richard.
Yeah. Yeah. And I can't help but ponder why we have this prohibition situation. Have you thought about that? Like why it exists? Isn't that the answer to that part of how we might shift things?
Yeah, because it's easy to say, oh, well, it's Nixon in 1970 and the Controlled Substances Act. But the reality is, we've been having prohibitions against these types of drugs for a long, long time. We've had witches burned all throughout Europe for their use of plant medicine. We had the colonialists who came here to the New World, who destroyed records and um, yeah, really tried to suppress the practice that they felt would conflict with Christianity. Um, or throughout the world, we see suppression by both church and state. And in America, we did have an anti-war movement and a civil rights movement, and the government decided that one of the best ways to combat both of those was to come down harshly on drugs, and that led to the Controlled Substances Act in 1970. It led to a harsher act in '86. And what we have spent in our country billions and billions and billions of dollars and imprisoned a ton of people on this war on drugs.
Mm.
And I do think that finally information is coming out and people are seeing that this isn't where resources should be spent. And they're seeing how unfairly we prosecuted black and brown people compared to white people. And I'm feeling that shifts are happening. We're seeing that in the state of Oregon and Colorado legalizing psychedelics. We're seeing it in city after city decriminalizing psychedelics. We're seeing it on a church one church just got a religious exemption from the government. So all of these are good signs, but yeah, it goes back a long, long way. This fear of what if we as individuals have direct experiences without a middleman with source.
Right. You can understand why that would be a threat to the church, organized religions. Why would that be a threat to the secular state?
I think I think back in the anti-war movement, there was a question of how are we going to get enough people to go fight this
Mm.
this war, and doing psychedelics and trying then to recruit people for combat is probably a pretty hard thing to do. And then in the civil rights movement, these tools where people can remember their power, remember that these are stories. Saying that I'm better than you because I have a different skin color is nonsense. And I think that's seen very clearly. These tools can be very magnifiers of that. Um, and because we all use psychedelics at the similar percentage across culture, but if you want then to pick on one culture or another, if you have something that's illegal, you can do that. And I think
Ah.
that's what the government was trying to do. They said, okay, well, we know everybody's doing drugs. Well, let's make them super illegal. And then let's go really persecute black and brown people. And that's what they did.
And and what was their motivation for persecuting black and brown people specifically?
I think they're trying to disrupt the civil rights movement that was happening. So they're trying to go after the leaders and the people that they saw
Right.
as agitators.
As a way to get the agitators in prison.
Yeah. The
Right.
so-called agitators in prison. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Um, and this, I suppose it's a meme, you might say, not in the way that we think about memes on the internet, but in terms of a cultural idea that there's such a thing as a bad trip that can permanently break your psyche. And there's an example in Britain, one of the early members of the band Pink Floyd supposedly had a bad trip and never recovered. Is that phenomenon real?
There is literature about like a persistent perceptual shift. I have not seen it. I've not met anyone who's seen it, but I know it does exist. It's just a small fraction of a fraction. What can happen is trauma can be compounded by taking these are powerful, powerful medicines. So let's again break it down. Source, if we take these medicines and they're laced with something, that can cause problems. if you take some of these medicines and you have a contraindication with something else you're taking, that can cause real damage, even death. We then get into the mindset. If the person doesn't know what they're walking into, they don't know how long it's going to last, they don't know, they don't feel safe, they don't have a clear intention, that can lead to more challenging experiences than other experiences. And then setting where we talk about the physical environment. So are you going to be interrupted by dogs, by kids, by neighbors, by Amazon? Are you going to be touched? Do you know who's
Mm.
around you? If you are truly scared, do you have a guide or facilitator who knows how to move you into another piece of your journey? If you're not, are they also able to help you explore why you're there, even if you are scared, and find that balance? Um, there are people in this space who, just like any other space, take advantage of positions of power. And when we take a psychedelic, we're in an incredibly vulnerable, non ordinary state of consciousness.
Right.
So having deep trust is part of this. Um, and when people act badly, they act badly. So when I think there's very few truly bad trips. I think bad trips are elements of these who are set and setting going wrong with a small piece. But there are many experiences that are challenging, that make us see things that are hard, that
Yeah.
are emotionally hard. And what the research says is even when a participant in a study says, this was one of the hardest things I've ever gone through, they will also still rank it as one of the 5 most important things that's ever happened to them in their lives.
Yeah.
So it can be both challenging and important at the same time. And that's certainly been my experience with these medicines. I've had some really challenging uh, things that have come to have risen up. Um, and I wouldn't have traded them for the world.
Right. But your point about setting, well, all three of the vectors you're describing there is apposite to me when I think about bad trips, because a lot of times when you hear when I heard stories of bad trips, friends of friends who'd taken a trip, and I never didn't take it as a kid, and they'd had like a bad trip. None of those were being attended to. They'd probably gone out and done it in a field with their mates, and some horrific stuff came up, and there was no support around it. So yeah, no wonder they related to it as a bad thing as opposed to a healing experience, because the whole context wasn't about healing.
Yeah. And in this non ordinary state, when things are coming up and then you have no support, I just can't imagine how the level of terror that can occur.
Yeah,
But when you're supported and you're there with intention, you're there in a well thought out container, it's the word we use. Yeah, those things can be managed differently.
yeah, yeah. And there's something slightly discomforting about the fact that, well, I don't know if this is true, but my perception is the biggest users of psychedelics right now, and to the extent to which I'm familiar with, British culture and use of psychedelics, is amongst teenagers in totally unsupported settings. So, no wonder we get these stories come out into the press. There was one not so long ago. A bunch of kids got lost on the moors in Wales, I think. They'd all taken mushrooms, and half of them got lost and came back with pneumonia. And yeah, that hit the front pages.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think the average age is 14 or 15 for someone to
Oh,
have their
okay. So
first. It's super young to have a
yeah,
first
so
psychedelic experience. And
that would
yeah,
match my
and
sense.
kids have access. And I do think we have a number of people who are accessing psychedelics in this medical model that we were talking about. And then these psychedelic churches I talked about in America, they are all throughout England as well. And I know you have big psychedelic societies over there. Um, yeah, I would bet there are more people accessing psychedelics that are adults in their 50s than there are teenagers.
Really
I would
interesting.
bet. And sorry, I don't mean like the once or twice, like I'm a teenager and I'm just goofing off and maybe, yeah, maybe. But I think there's a lot of adults doing really beautiful work with these medicines. And in the UK, I mean, you have both Imperial College of London and King's College that are both doing tremendous, tremendous work in the space. And there are a few other colleges also, but those two are really leaders in psychedelics for breaking of repetitive thinking patterns. So stick with me for just a moment on this. When we think about as we get older, we are pruning our neural pathways and we literally get stuck in our ways as we get older, some to different degrees. And that can manifest as all sorts of things with the psychedelic. So it's like our minds actually went from as kids running all over a playground to being put onto a treadmill and no one told us. The psychedelic lifts us off that treadmill, puts us back in the playground. We can run around. We can remember that there are other ways to think about ourselves, our jobs, our lives, our relationships, and the way we've been thinking about them. But the breaking of repetitive thinking patterns is why psychedelics are being studied for depression, anxiety, OCD, eating disorders, substance use challenges, even autism. The same principle is there. We get into these grooves, and how do we break the groove? And how do we remind ourselves, oh, I don't live in the groove. I just got stuck in the groove.
Yeah.
And I think Imperial College and King's College are doing beautiful, beautiful work with this.
Wow. I love how you've described that. And two things combined as you say that. One is my mother suffers from dementia, and actually reading your book on site of the Veterans Guide, I was thinking, can I get my mother on a retreat somewhere and see if that would make a difference? The second was, as you were talking there, breaking thinking patterns. But what are we talking about in a business context all the time? How can we have more creative, more innovative thinking? How can we break out of our patterns of how we think things should be done? And so immediately I'm thinking of business applications for leadership.
Yeah, and certainly that's why, Tim Ferriss famously says he doesn't know any billionaires that don't do psychedelics. Um,
Really?
mhm.
They just
Yeah,
keep quiet about it in the main.
some quiet, some not so quiet. And Musk is not so quiet about it.
Right. Yeah. He's talked about his ketamine use. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And and then we've seen microdosing kind of. So in Silicon Valley back in the 60s, they took engineers who had a problem that they couldn't solve for a few months, gave them a psychedelic. And I don't know, 2/3 of them were able to solve the problem that they were going after. It was a big number. It's a pretty famous study. And since then, so why I think Silicon Valley is like, well, if that works for macro doses, what if we just take a little bit of drugs and maybe that helps us be more creative? And again, the research is split, but that's kind of led to that in the business world. What I like about it for business people is that, okay, you can take these psychedelics and get back to the root of why and to remembering that you don't have to do any of these things to be who you are and to be worthy of love and to be worthy of just worthy, period. And you can choose to do whatever things you want to do and live with that alignment. And that is, I think that's just pretty incredible as a business tool,
Yeah.
let alone bringing it to a specific problem, which I think is beautiful. And then something that is not talked about as much because it's not truly medical and it's not really spiritual, but it certainly makes sense. If we break repetitive thinking patterns, we can see things in new ways. There's a great fMRI study from Imperial College where they took brain images of brains and then brains on psilocybin. And you can see how even though the amount of neural connections are the same, the brain is lit up and parts of the brain are talking to other parts of the brain that don't normally communicate. And that's the visual representation of these insights and awarenesses and awakenings taking place. And again, super grateful for I think that was Robin Card Harris, Imperial College of London, that led those first studies, and there's been multiple ones since then looking at brain connectivity and psychedelics.
I should get a couple of those guys on the podcast. Sounds fascinating. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and for you personally, where have you found the most, or the biggest benefits from you in terms of leadership? Sticking to that, Matt, like with your businesses, and I know you mentioned earlier it's allowed you to step back and take a sort of broader view. But are there any specific instances you can think of in terms of your leadership?
Yeah, I think for me, it's recognizing that what I actually do doesn't matter all that much in the grand scheme of things. But what I want for me is to have, to be creative, to be able to create things. What I want for me is to be in relationship with people. What I want for me is to not take this world for granted and to remember how lucky I am to be alive. Um, and how supported I am by, if I just take a moment and just say, okay, wait, let me just feel the weight of the earth underneath my feet and remember, wow, I am supported. And looking outside, I have a window here in front of me and seeing all these green trees and knowing, okay, wait, these are our plant allies supporting this existence. Um, I don't need, I don't need to look for anything external for happiness because I carry it around with me, period. So then
Yeah.
that has allowed me then to enter into a different level of presence with our discussions, with my discussions. It's allowed me to enter into relationship in a different way. I don't need anything from you. And
Mm.
maybe we'll collaborate on something and maybe we won't. And that's okay. And there's plenty for everyone. It's this abundant mindset. I can just support and love you and whatever it is that you choose to do without having to put my lens and my feelings and my judgment on it. And I like operating from that place. And I also know that I recognize it's a place of privilege, and that's a place of um, that there's still a lot of things that are not the way I would like them in the world. And I try to find that balance between where do I want to make change, and where does my body feel like I need to make change, and where do I feel like this is a place to be accepting and loving, and the change will happen. Somebody else will lead the change in that particular thing, or no change is needed.
Mm. Mushroom privilege.
Mushroom privilege.
Yeah. No, but you have this extraordinary quality in your being. Like I said earlier in the show, yeah, you really do emanate it, like this calm, loving, centered presence. Uh, uh, yeah, I I just have
I
to say,
appreciate that.
that this isn't you describing the effects of mushrooms. It's me experiencing the effect right
I
firsthand
love
through
that.
your presence.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, and I can only imagine what you were like pre this. Yeah, yeah. What were you sort of more of the sort of typical hard driving, CEO persona? Would you say?
Yeah. I mean, I was the guy, if you said we need to go from point A to point B or A to Z, I would create the 25 things between A and Z that have to get
Okay,
done, the timeline that they need to get done. I would help the teams coordinate. How do we do it? And I'd be hyper focused on we are going to get there to point Z. I think the difference now is I spend much, much, much more time saying, how are we going to be in those tasks? And how
okay,
might Z might be where we're headed and Z might change, and that's okay. But if every step of the way we are in recognizing that we are in this process together and that this is what matters, this relationship is what matters, these discussions are what matters, this shared love is what matters, and we have to generate resources, we have to feed and house and do those things, and finding more of that balance versus just being focused on this is the end goal, this is where we're going, and that's it.
right. Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. Um, I know you wanted to finish at the top of the hour. I had one more reflection, if that's all right.
Of course.
Yeah. Um, or reflection, I suppose. Question for those who who say, "Okay, I get it's not addictive, but aren't you developing a dependence on these tools for your spiritual progression? And wouldn't it be better if you were able to continue to grow spiritually without the dependence?" What would your answer to that be?
If that might be better for some people and not better
Right.
for others, and
Got it.
that's beautiful. Why not? Many paths up the mountain.
Yeah.
Um, I know for me and for a lot of people that I know that are deep into this work, that the amount of medicine we take has gone radically down.
Ah,
And that we might sit in a ceremony where many others are taking larger doses of medicine, and we're on a very, very, very little bit, just enough to get into the energetic plane. Um, I know, and I'm gonna switch here from psilocybin to ayahuasca. When we journey into Central and South America, with the ayahuasca taitas and shaman. They're
What's the
drinking
difference between a
ayahuasca.
taita and a shaman? Sorry, I was going to
It's
ask that
just a
earlier.
different name, maestro, taita,
Okay,
shaman, just
fine.
different names for the spiritual leaders of these different communities. They're drinking ayahuasca every week, multiple times every week, as they lead their journeys. The curanderas, the healing, many indigenous in Mexico, as an example, with psilocybin, they were taking psilocybin mushrooms regularly. So I think when done with intention again, uh, eh, it's just another way to connect. And then the
Yeah,
quantity and what's better, what's not better, I don't know. I know it works for me,
yeah,
and that's I guess that's another thing that's come out of this for me is like in some of the work I do, I just give it all away because I'm not saying that anyone should do anything the way I do it. I'm just trying to explain
yes,
this is the logic and that these are the things I think about in making the choices that I've made. And maybe this will be helpful to you. And if it's not, great, ignore it. And if it is, great. And if there's some variation on it, I'd love to know what the variation is because I'm trying to continue to learn. Um, yeah. So I don't, I would, it's not that I struggle. It's that I say back to that person, if that's what works for you, that's what you should do.
yeah, yeah. No, that makes sense. It must be the Puritan in me that wants to ask that question. Yeah, probably there is still some part of me that has a value around being independent of substances.
Yeah,
Um,
but let's take another angle on this, Richard. I think this is a topic that is never covered, and I think we should cover it for a second. So for all of time, we have done things to alter our our state. Sometimes, as we've been talking about in this podcast, we've talked about taking a substance to alter our state. Other times, people have fasted. Let's go
yes,
into the desert for 40 days and fast. Other times, they've gone into darkness. Let's go into a cave for a period of time. Other times, we've mutilated our bodies and created pain. Um, Other times, there's been epileptic seizures and things that have led to spiritual occurrences, awakenings. Um, there are many. Meditation
yes,
is yet another example. There's so many ways that we do things to alter. Running is a way to alter our state.
right,
Um, so we have historically used many different things to alter our state of consciousness, often in the pursuit of connecting with source. What I would theorize or put out to you is okay, and these substances allow us to do it with more regularity and less risk than some of those other choices. So, why would we say fasting is an okay way to have a spiritual experience, but taking a naturally growing substance like a psychedelic mushroom is not?
yeah, yeah. No, it's great. It's a great corrective for me. Like I say, I'm sort of I'm reflecting on my own value set as we have this conversation.
No, and not corrective. So I don't love that. It's just
Well, no,
this
maybe
is the
that's the wrong word. I suppose a way to reflect on. It's giving me a
yeah.
pause to reflect. Let's put it that way.
And that's this conversation. That's this
Yeah.
relationship. That's what's happening here in
Mm.
our conversation. Whoever is still listening to this, they're in their minds doing their own journey. And
Yes.
that's the local power of we do our work first for ourselves. And then we invite our closest people into that work. And
Yes.
if we're doing that with alignment and intention, we can change the world by changing ourselves.
Beautifully put. Yes. Yes. Yeah. That's why I'm all ears to it. That's why I'm totally open to it. I mean, yeah. I I want what I've had in terms of my own transformation. For others to get there, and if using psychedelics is their route to it, then I want to celebrate that and promote that. And of course, I'm also curious for my own journey from where I'm at now. Could psychedelics play a role? I'm having great fun with some of my meditations, and my most psychedelic experiences have actually come through meditation. So
They're so closely aligned. And in my experience, people who meditate, they're able to be aware of being aware. And then psychedelics just adds another layer of that awareness.
Yes. But I want to stay open to what else might be out there. That's why I'm loving having this conversation. All right. Well, I know, Matt, you wanted to wrap 7 minutes ago, so I'm appreciating my extra 7 minutes of Matt time. Okay, so we should let people know where they can find you, learn more about your work, if this conversation has sparked their curiosity.
Yeah, mattzemon.com is kind of the easiest way to get in touch with me. If you're looking for a speaker, there's videos, there's a guide to microdosing, all sorts of things are on mattzemon.com. Amazon and Audible have my book. So I have the Psychedelics for Everyone. I have the Veteran's Guide to Psychedelics and Beyond the Trip are all there. And then I'm active on LinkedIn and Instagram. So those are great. I love it when people follow me, and certainly when they have questions, if they actually interact with me, I love that.
Brilliant. And I love the fact you're active on LinkedIn, because again, as I said, before we came on the show here, that's a big part of my purpose here, is bringing this message to the business community especially. So that's great.
I appreciate you doing this. I appreciate you bringing this to the business community, because the reality is, at least in my perspective, there is no such thing as work-life balance. There's no such thing as work-life. There's just life. And sometimes we're generating resources, and sometimes we're hanging around the campfire, and sometimes we're having dinner with our family. But it's just life. And how we spend those times, how we spend that day is all that really matters. So I think this is a great tool for humans. Some of those humans also are business people.
Yes, exactly. Wonderful. All right. Matt, thank you. Thank you once again. And for people out there, it's mattzemon.com, Z or Z if you're American, EMON, Matt with double T. So mattzemon.com. Fabulous. Thanks again. Thank you, Matt.
Richard, thank you. Awesome. I appreciate this very much.
Thank you.